Moshe Taragin for the OU All Parsha video series for Parshas Vizos Habracha. Parshas Vizos Habracha, like Parshas Hazinu, was written as a poem. Every phrase is laden, pregnant with multiple layers of meaning. Sometimes people actually get confused. I get confused sometimes where pasuk is in Hazinu or Vizos Habracha because they're both poems. In general, Hazinu is about the history of humanity, history of Am Yisrael, history of the people punished or torturing Am Yisrael and getting divine justice, whereas Psukim that have to do with Am Yisrael and its traits and its Shvatim are more likely to be in Parshas Vizos Habracha, not in Parshas Hazinu. Every pasuk is a shir unto its own, and of course the P'tira of Moshe Rabbeinu towards the end of the parsha, and the moniker of Yisrael Elokim in the beginning of the parsha. So it's very easy to get riveted or focused upon a particular pasuk because each pasuk is a kvutza sav tal talim, has tilei tilim shel agadatos that emanate from it. But we give an overview of something that runs like a thread throughout Parshas Vizos Habracha. Obviously, Moshe is delivering brachos, but he's also looking at prophecies and delivering prophecies to the various shvatim, and he delivers blessings to them based on their shevet's trajectory. This is pretty clear towards the end of Parshas Vizos Habracha, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes Moshe up to Har Nevo, and he sees Dan, Naphtali, Eretz Ephraim, Menashe, Yehuda, Yam Acharon, Negev, Kikar, Begasirecho, all the different locations. Chazal tells, Rashi quotes it, Moshe is not looking at locations on a map, but he's looking at events that will unfold. Most of these events are events that will take place, that will occur, up into and including the first Beis HaMikdash, namely Sefer Yeshua, through Sefer Malachim, and most of them pertain to either the conquest of Eretz Yisrael or betrayals in HaKadosh Baruch Hu that some of the Shvatim commit. But there is one phrase that perhaps stretches Moshe Rabbeinu's vision beyond those couple centuries. In Pasuk Beis of Perek Lamed Daled, Moshe sees Kol Naphtali, sees Eretz Ephraim, Menashe, sees Kol Eretz Yehuda, Ad Hayam Acharon, until the Yam Acharon, which of course would be the Mediterranean Sea, which would be the end, the final border, the final frontier of the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. But Rashi says the word Yam Hacharon could also mean Ad Hayom Hacharon. He sees until the last day, which means that Moshe Rabbeinu isn't just casting his vision across 300-400 years. He's casting his vision, or even 700 years. He's casting his vision across thousands of years. Which means that Moshe's nevuos now have to be seen not just as localized or limited to the first Beis HaMikdash or even before, but as nevuos that pertain to all of history. Now the truth is that everything that happens in the Torah recycles. Ma'aseh Avosim Labanim doesn't just mean that what happened to our avos serves as guidance to their children and their descendants, but it happens again. They're historical templates. Judaism, unlike other cultures, does not see history as open-ended and evolutionary. Doesn't see time as meaningless as some cultures do. Neither of those two, both of those are separate approaches. We see history as purpose-oriented, design-driven. There's a beginning, there's an end. The beginning of history is creation, the end of history is redemption. We drive humanity towards redemption. And we also see that within that arc, within that trajectory, events that happened before happen again, especially if they are redemptive events and not just anecdotal events. Redemptive events are events that pertain to the Jewish people, in particular in their homeland, or pertaining their desire and struggle to return to their homeland. So what happens in Shushan is ultimately a redemptive event because Am Yisrael is in the process of returning to Eretz Yisrael. The process has begun, it's stalled because of opposition from the locals. So what's happening in Shushan is not just a miracle in a bottle, it's part of the redemptive struggle to get back to Eretz Yisrael in so many ways. So what happens to our avos, and certainly what happens in Eretz Yisrael, is bound to happen again. And that's why nevuos are not just ancient artifacts of how Yirmiyah or Zechariah or Yechezkel describe certain events, but the events that they foretold and foreshadowed recycle upon themselves. So any event that's wrapped up in Jewish history, in Jewish land, in Jewish people, in Jewish redemption, recycles, and you need the lenses to be able to see through the shell. The shell seems different. We don't herd goats. We don't wear sandals, although some Israelis do wear sandals. We live in a technologically advanced world of cars and planes and internet and social media and artificial intelligence, but that's just the shell. If you look through the shell into the life and the heart of the matter, the heart of experience, the prophecies are all relevant and resonant and have contemporary meaning. So in honor of Eretz Yisrael, I want to discuss 3 prophecies that Moshe sees or envisions that he, in the immediate sense, he sees them within the context of the Shvatim and the first Beis HaMikdash, but as we know, what happened in the first Beis HaMikdash will happen again. And they're happening again as we speak, as we're beginning the redemptive return, and in the Shvach of Eretz Yisrael, because 2 years ago when we not last, but when we read V'zos Habracha, Eretz Yisrael was violated, and Eretz Yisrael was attacked. It wasn't just an attack on our people, it was an attack on our cities. And we daven Simcha Li'artzeinu, V'sasan Li'reinu, Simcha Li'artzecha, V'sasan Li'recha. These cities should be restored, and hopefully as I speak, there are processes that are taking place. HaKol B'dei Shamayim, HaMamlech Melachim, V'lo HaMlucha, but Hashem may be sending Meshluchim and messengers and agents to perhaps move history forward. Certainly returning our hostages is an event for not celebration. Celebration is a trivial word that trivializes it, cheapens it, but for success and at least solace and comfort and healing, which our people desperately need, let alone all the soldiers who are away from their families and now for 2 years, including Yom Tov. I can speak from personal example. Some of them, not all of them, obviously it's not like there's a 180-degree turnaround, but some of them will be reunited with their families again if some of the fighting and the war abates. In any event, getting back to these nevuos, let's first start with a statement about, about Yosef, and then we'll move to the bracha of, I think it's Asher, then we'll move to the bracha of Zevulun, and we'll see statements about Eretz Yisrael that happened then, but are happening now, and then we'll see on the back end something that happened then, which was unfortunate, even though well-intentioned, and may be happening again. So this is to restore the glory and the honor of Eretz Yisrael, to remind ourselves that we're not living in Israel, we're living in Eretz Yisrael, we're not living through a geopolitical struggle, we're living through Yivos and Mashiach. It may be hundreds of years, but the struggle of Bris Avos and the struggle to rebuild our people and our peoplehood in our ancient homeland under the eye of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Yosef is described as one of the driving forces in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. The beginning of the parsha section describes his agricultural success, but in the middle, Bechor Sharo Hadar Lo, he's the lead ox, Sikarner Im Karnav. He has very, very exalted horns. Bohema Mimyin Agach Yachdav Af Searetz, and with those horns, he will gore Af Searetz, the edges of the earth. Which edges of the earth is Yosef goring? So Rashi says, it means the 31 chieftains and warlords who occupied Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan then, and Av Searetz then becomes a nickname for Eretz Yisrael. So why is Av Searetz a nickname for Eretz Yisrael, the same land that Yosef will conquer with his very beautiful, exalted, strong horns? Karneriim, Karnav, Behema, Amimyan, Agach, Av Searetz. Why is Eretz Yisrael nicknamed Av Searetz? So Rashi says because every single empire in that ancient world wanted a toehold and a palace or some hold in Israel, because they knew it was so important. Rashi quotes the pasuk in Yirmiyah, Nachlas Tzvi Tzivos Goyim. It's something desired by all the nations. So everyone made a big to-do about this little country between the river and the sea that the small Jewish people were inhabiting. And they all wanted consulates and embassies. They all wanted shares. They all wanted parts of it. And therefore, it was called Av Searetz because it was localized and focused geographically. It spread across the entire ancient world, because no matter how far you were, even if you were in Britain, let's say, which was the end of the ancient world, I don't know if people were living there, but that was the islands right before the Atlantic. Everyone, even those warlords and chieftains, wanted to hold all those Vikings and all the barbarians wanted to hold. No insult to the British, that's what it was in those days. Wanted to hold in Eretz Yisrael, and of course, what happened before happens again. And they didn't just want to hold in Eretz Yisrael for random, arbitrary reasons. They sensed subliminally, this is the land of Hashem, this is the presence of Hashem, and therefore everyone wanted to be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it was, and so it is. The disproportion with which Israel is treated, the level of attention that Israel receives, the discriminatory policies towards Israel, the opposition, the fierce opposition towards our being in Eretz Yisrael, Shama Mimir Gazon, it's frustrating, it's painful, but we're not surprised. This is the land of Hashem. People don't want Iceland. People don't want Canada. People don't want Venezuela. No insult intended to those listening in those countries. But this is Av Searetz. This is the land of Hashem. This is Hadom Raglav. This is Shara Shemayim. This is Beis Elokim. This is, as Chazal tell us, one day Yerushalayim will be the metropolis, and every other city in the world, from Beijing to Tokyo, to Paris, to New York, to Moscow, will all be suburbs of Yerushalayim. Therefore, the nations of the world in Shir Hashirim are referred to as Benos Yerushalayim, the word Benos being a suburb. So it was in the day of Moshe Rabbeinu, so it is in our day in 2025, Tafshin Pevav. Eretz Yisrael is literally Avsei Aretz. When Asher is described, so Asher's bracha is described as Barzel unechoshes min alecha. Your shoes or your locks, Locks, will be iron and copper. Uchiamecha davecha. One interpretation which Rashi provides is that you will draw iron and copper from the mountains around you, and you'll mine some of that iron and copper. Of course, this is a bracha delivered to Asher, who lived in the highlands, but it's reminiscent of the pasuk in Ekev in Paraches, which the entire Eretz Yisrael is described. Eretz asher lo b'miskenes tacha b'alechem. You don't have to beg for your food. You don't have to scrounge on food. Lo techzor kolbo. Nothing is missing. Eretz asher avaneha barzel. The stones are iron. U'meharareha, and from its mountains tachsov nechoshes. So the mountains of Israel pour forth iron and copper, and Asher lived in the highlands, so he has specific access to Barzel unechoshes min alecha uchiamecha devecha. Not quoting Rashi, I'm just quoting what should be obvious from the pasuk. If you're trying to describe the beauty and the wealth and the affluence of Eretz Yisrael and the brachos, you would normally, typically in every culture, describe it as mountains that provide gold and silver, kesev v'zahav, asher lehem, as all the foreign idolatrous cultures decorated and adorned their idols and their sites and their sacral sites and their palaces and their monuments with gold and silver. And gold and silver was wealth, gold and silver were precious metals. And yet Eretz Yisrael is not described ever as a land that provides gold and silver, in part because it doesn't want to associate life in Eretz Yisrael with greed and avarice. There's a very famous story where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his Talmidim, one of his Talmidim went to America, went to Chutz La'aretz and struck it rich, struck gold, and the other students, the other Talmidim, were very jealous. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai went out to the mountain, probably Mount Meron. I think the Medrash's Lashon is Meron. I think it's the only time that the mountain of Meron is associated with the Shimon Bar Yochai, and he miraculously draws gold and silver from the mountains, and he says, look, if you want gold and silver, you don't have to get on a flight, you can just stay here, but just know that the gold and silver you take in this world will diminish your share in the next world. But the Torah doesn't describe the mountains of Israel naturally providing gold and silver. Shimon Bar Yochai was able to summon it supernaturally, miraculously. What it does describe is copper and iron. And I think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is instructing us that we have to provide utility and technology and science and advance and human welfare and human machinery and human advance. And that's the role of Am Yisrael, is to be able to, Vehei Bracha, is to provide spiritual guidance, moral guidance, spiritual guidance, cultural repair, and also to be a source of material welfare for people. Copper and iron are typically associated with manufacture, typically associated with utility. If you put gold and silver on one side, gold and silver have relatively less utilitarian use. They're just for adornment, for money, for wealth, for affluence, for beauty, for aesthetics. Whereas iron and copper have real utility. They can be used as metals to create, to craft, to build, to create shields, to create defense, to create war weapons. And you don't use gold, you don't use silver. These are harsher, more powerful, more sturdy metals. Not being a metallurgist, but not even knowing how to say metallurgist. But what's interesting to me is that this is coming true, but in a very different way. The resource that's most valuable in today's world is oil. And interestingly enough, Eretz Yisrael, at least the dry part of Eretz Yisrael, the dry land, doesn't have any oil. And it's very odd because we're in a region in which almost every one of our neighbors, not all of them, but many of them have oil resources, and Eretz Yisrael doesn't. I think that's part of a larger narrative. I don't think HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be burning oil indefinitely, and I think at some point science will overtake leisure, and we'll discover other forms of energy, and I think it's going to create a sea change politically, and all the countries whose economies are based solely on oil production are going to face stiff crisis and stiff tests. Of course, we have discovered natural gas across the ocean, but more importantly, we're producing iron and copper but not in the literal sense. I don't think we're mining that much from Israel proper, but we're certainly in the copper and iron of the day taking the lead, and that's ingenuity and innovation and technology, and copper and iron should be seen as a metaphor, not as specific metals. So we're not primarily looking to accrue wealth without producing anything. Let's say like some of the countries in our area, thinking of Qatar in particular, which has been in the news lately, which has created spheres of influence in the modern world simply because of oil money. We're actually producing medical technology, agricultural technology, weapons technology, many different technologies that help humanity and that advance humanity. And that's, of course, part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's desire that Avram b'yehiyeh bracha. So for Moshe, it was copper and iron because those were the ores and minerals necessary for productivity. Today, we've moved to a virtual world, and hopefully we'll continue to play that role. And which leads me to the next interesting statement about Zevulun. Zevulun lives across the sea, along the sea, and their region is described as Kishefa Yamim Yinaku. They draw the harvest and the abundance of the sea. Usefune Timune Chol. Very interesting articulation. Sefune Timune Chol, which means things that hide in the sand. Tamun is something that hides. Safun safun is a strange word, samach peinun, but it can mean something, it sounds like the word safun, something that's, Rashi says, kisui timune chol, which could mean the chilazon that were very expensive, that were on the sea, where SEA, where Zevulun had a share. It could be the zechuchas lavana, certain types of glass that they had to manufacture with the sea water. But basically, all these hidden riches and hidden assets of the sea and the sand were reaped and harvested by Asher. Rashi then gives a different shot. Rashi says, based on the next word, or in the beginning of the pasuk, Amim Har Yikro Sham Yizbechu Zivchei Tzedek. They will be called the nation to the mountain, and they will give sacrifices. What do the nation of the mountain and the sacrifices have to do with Zevulun making a lot of money through chilazon and making a lot of money through glass? Namely, what is the end of the pasuk? Making money through glass and sand resources have to do with the beginning of the pasuk, the nation of the mountain who bring sacrifices. So Rashi says that seafarers and businessmen and tradesmen will arrive in Israel simply to do business, for commercial interests with Zevulun, to buy and trade chilazon dye, very expensive, we call that chelas, to buy and trade special glass that they could manufacture, to buy and trade other wares and other commodities. And they'll say, well, once we're here already in Israel, we've landed for financial motives and financial incentives, let's go to Yerushalayim and see about their religion, because we've heard strange things. These are the people that worship one God. These are the people that eat similarly. These are the people that are federalized and centralized, and we all have different gods and different states and different chieftains, different cultures, different foods. And they realize the value, both theologically as well as experientially, of unity, of federalization, of standardization, of having one God, but also one people, one culture, one way of life, one system, and they convert. They actually convert, Rashi says, they're miskayer to be Jews, miskayer in Sham. So essentially you have a phenomena where people land in Israel, take an interest in Israel for purely financial reasons, just because they want to invest in the Israeli stock market or invest in Israeli startups, and at some point that rolls over into non-commercial affiliation, in this case religious affiliation, theological commitment, but it could just be, again, national affiliation to see the Jewish people and Jewish state in a better light. And we hope this will continue. To a degree, it continued. October 7th threw a monkey wrench in it, and there's been a lot of anti-Israel sentiment in the wake of our justifiable war to defend ourselves, although some countries are still deeply vested in our people. A lot of Americans who may be listening to this is an OU video, are less familiar with some of the dynamics in Central and Eastern Europe, the countries like Hungary and Romania, and places that are still deeply committed to the Jewish people, Jewish state, let alone India. Of course, not enough to offset some of the other vociferous enemies of the Jewish people, enemies of the Jewish state, hostility towards the Jewish state. But hopefully after the war abates, hopefully some of this can be reversed and people will once again return to be supporters and admirers of Israel maybe even admirers of Israel's God and the values that we stand for that are under siege and that are eroding, in part because they will be interested in trade agreements with Israel, certainly behind the Abraham Accords and other strides towards peace. So these are three events that Moshe envisions, all of which are obviously noteworthy, all of which are remarkable, and all of which seem to be repeating themselves in the current era. Number one, Eretz Yisrael is an Afsei Aretz. People are interested across the globe in having a toehold in Israel. Number two, we're providing copper and iron, not gold and silver. We're providing utility, technology, advance, manufacture. Number three, people are being drawn towards Israel as a financial powerhouse, but hopefully it leads to larger discoveries, whether they be discovery of the Jewish people or ultimately, as we hope, discovery of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we hope that process and dynamic continues and actually recovers after it has been disrupted by this war. And then there is a different pattern that seems to be repeating itself. In the story of Gad, so Gad is one of the nations that choose to dwell in Ever Yarden, which is generally seen by Moshe in Parshas Matos as a erroneous decision, as a dangerous decision. It comes back to bite them. As we see, they slowly disappear from the Jewish story, even before the Aseres HaShavatim, and even before they disappear in the end of Yoshua. There's a lot of suspicion about them seceding as a different people, and diplomats have to be sent, have to be dispatched to patch things up. It's a very fraught decision. And at least the way we read the decision in Matos, it was a less than holy decision. The incentives weren't that pure and lofty. They found the pasture land very fertile. They felt that it was suitable for their cattle, for their children, for their families. Come to Israel. You can live in Israel. You may not strike it rich. You may not have a large house. You may not have several cars in your driveway. But maybe living in Israel is more important than making a little extra money. But in Parshas V'zos Habracha, it sounds like, at least according to Rashi, that there was a noble cause, a noble reason. Vayar Reish Yislo, they first saw Reishis before we entered Eretz Yisrael. They first saw this God as their land. Kisham Chalkas Mechokek Safun, because there the portion of the Mechokek, of the lawgiver, Vayaser Shevet Mehuda Umechokek Mi Ben Raglav. We all know that pasuk in Vayechi there refers to Yehuda, but here Rashi says the Mechokek refers to Moshe. The portion of the Mechokek, the classic, the epitome, our typical Mechokek Moshe Rabbeinu is hidden. Again, the word Safun, this time with a Samach, not with a Sin. Safun, so Moshe's share is hidden. So Rashi says that God actually lived near Har Nevo, where Moshe was buried. And they chose to stay in Ever Yarden because they wanted to be near Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, that's a little bit historically intriguing. I think there's someone at my door, so I'm home alone, so I hear my door opening up, so I'm just going to shut this for a second. I'll come right back. Okay, it's a good thing I stopped the shir. We're having, Baruch Hashem, a lot of people for Yom Tov. Some of my sons-in-law are in the army, so we're hosting grandchildren and parents, and so we ordered some food for Yom Tov, and I was supposed to be the one listening for the door, putting them in the kitchen, so I did my job, so he's putting it in the kitchen, and I'll continue the shir. And anyway, so historically, it's a little bit strange because God already makes the decision to stay in Chutz La'aretz in Parshas Matos. Does Moshe already know exactly where he'll be buried in Matos? Remember, in Pinchas, he ascends Har Havarim, but just because he ascends Har Havarim doesn't mean that that's where he'll be buried. So this suggests that God already knew the general region where Moshe would be buried and chose to stay in Chutz La'aretz and forfeit their right to live in Eretz Yisrael because they want to be near the Gadol, near Moshe Rabbeinu. And if we just abstract it beyond just the decision about Moshe Rabbeinu, it appears to be a trend where people who have the opportunity to live in Eretz Yisrael choose not to live in Eretz Yisrael for what would seem to be justifiable reasons, but yet, even though the Shevet of God has lofty, noble reasons, they want to be near Moshe Rabbeinu, generally it doesn't work out. There's very little favorable opinion of God expressed. So if God is making the choice to stay in Chutz La'aretz because they want to be near Moshe Rabbeinu, ultimately that's a decision that Tanakh, our Masara, frowns upon. Namely, if you have the chance to be in Eretz Yisrael, don't give it up and don't surrender it because there's some other value that can offset it, or kind of other reason not to move to Eretz Yisrael. This isn't a move to Eretz Yisrael or your life is empty message, but it does spotlight the flaw in that logic. Now keep again, there's Gemara and Ksubos in which certain Amoraim were very opposed to others moving from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael because Bavel was a center of Torah. So when Talmud Torah is poised against life in Eretz Yisrael, well, that's part of the conversation of the late 19th century. 1 second, he's at the door. Again, I'm sorry about all the interruptions. The person just needed my attention. So the Gemara in Ksubos does hold up Talmud Torah as a reason, at least according to some Amoraim. Rabbi Yehuda felt that his Talmud Rav Zer should not make Aliyah, and he had to avoid his supervision. So, at least in this case, the desire to stay in Chutz La'aretz, to be near Moshe Rabbeinu, which is attributed to Bnei Gad, doesn't work out well. God ultimately disappears from Am Yisrael's history. To say in a more general sense, if you're in Israel, you're within Jewish history. If you're not in Israel, then you're at least facing the peril of disappearing as God did. Doesn't mean that everyone who doesn't live in Israel disappears. We believe in Bias HaGol Tzedek and in Mashiach and people coming, but you're already on the periphery of Jewish history. If you're in Israel, you're in the middle, dab smack of Jewish history, which of course raises the whole question that a lot of people are struggling with today. Moving to Israel, if it will come at the cost of how I raise my children and how much Torah I'll learn, and which is an important calculus, but don't use American terms like off the derech to describe people in Israel who are battling to defend Jewish history and searching for HaKadosh Baruch Hu in ways that may not cohere with classic halachic modes for all sorts of reasons, which obviously is I'm not justifying it, but to use a term such as off the derech for people that are squarely on the derech and squarely building the derech, it's a very inappropriate application. And vice versa, if you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, well, obviously, if you're Shomer Torah Mitzvos, you're holding one very, very tightly to our Masara, and hopefully you'll get a messianic ticket to Eretz Yisrael. But the decision to stay in Chutz La'aretz because you want to be near Moshe Rabbeinu and near Moshe Rabbeinu's kever doesn't work out well for God. So 3 historical patterns that are favorable, that end favorably, or not end, but they're favorable dynamics, namely Eretz Yisrael is Apsei Eretz. Number 2, iron and copper, not gold and silver. Number 3, people arrive in Israel for commercial interests, become interested in our culture, hopefully our God. And then one which is unfortunate, God disappears from history, at least according to Rashi, they had positive and favorable motivations. They wanted to be near Chalkas Mechokek Safon, the hidden portion of our lawgiver, Moshe Rabbeinu.